Welcome back. The last 2 weeks we were talking about the Enlightenment and some of the ideals that changed things for the classical period. We are now, for the rest of our term, going to talk about the symphony. Because as we said earlier, the symphony was really the most important musical force of the classical period. So let's get in to start thinking about the symphony. The genres of music that arose in the classical period, replacing those of the Baroque period, continued to hold their own in the 19th century. Indeed, they are still in use today, at least in the sense that their names are still encountered. Not surprisingly, the style, the number of movements, and the forms employed today will bear little relation to norms that were operative 200 years ago and more. But it is still true that if you compose a large, impressive concert piece for orchestra, the best way to convey that fact to conductors, musicians, and audiences is to name it a symphony. One reason for the prominence of the symphony in the classical era is its close association with a crucial development in the sociology of music, as we had previously discussed, and that's the growth of public concerts. As concerts became more and more frequent, people felt a need for some genre that would make an effective, substantial focus for those occasions. Symphonies filled the bill and in turn required more variety and flexibility of sound than anything orchestras of the early 18th century could provide. The symphonies spurred a major technical development within music, the evolution of the classical orchestra. The symphony, then, is rightly viewed as the crowning achievement of the Viennese classical era, but when any musician acknowledges this, he or she wants to add a plea in the same breath, and that's to please don't forget the other genres that grew up alongside the symphony. For these genres accommodate music that you will find just as beautiful and that has become for us sometimes just as precious. Later on, we'll study the sonata, the classical concerto, the string quartet, and, in the field of opera, Italian opera buffa. But this year, our focus will be on the symphony. As with Baroque genres, works in the classical period consist of several movements, which contrast in tempo and are composed in different musical forms. The outline that you see on your screen gives the particulars for the four movements of a typical symphony. You may want to go back and think about the Baroque concerto and compare these brief descriptions to what we saw to the Baroque concerto. So, the first and opening movement of a symphony is a substantial piece in fast or moderate tempo, written in the most important new form of the time, which was sonata form. Sometimes this fast music is preceded by a short but solemn introduction in a slower tempo, and we will in just a moment discuss sonata form. The second movement strikes an obvious contrast with the first by its slow tempo and its quiet mood. The third movement contrasts in another way by its persistent dance rhythms. It is always a minuet and trio. A minuet is a moderately paced dance in triple meter. The fourth, the closing movement, is fast again, if anything, faster than the first. It may also be in sonata form, like the first movement. If we compare the symphony table with the Baroque concerto, we see many differences, but also certain similarities. The forms used for the movements are entirely different, and there is the extra minuet. However, even in the broadest terms, the sequence from fast, complex, to slow, quiet, to fast, brilliant is the same. A word of caution, though. The symphony table represents the norm, but there are always exceptions. Some famous ones are Mozart's Prague Symphony that lacks a minuet, the Haydn Farewell Symphony with a second slow movement making 5 movements in all, and Bach's first Brandenburg Concerto has 2 dance movements added to the normal 3. So there is some room, especially for masters. A new form developed during this time called sonata form. It closely associated with the symphony and indeed with nearly all other music of the time. The opening movement of every symphony is in sonata form, and this movement counts as the intellectual and emotional core for the whole work. Many classical works have 2 or as many as 3 movements in this same form. The reason for the wide use, perhaps, was that more than any other form, sonata form exploited what was the overriding interest of classical composers. This was an interest in contrast of every kind, especially contrast of thematic material and contrast of keys or tonality. In any case, whatever the reason, composers found sonata form particularly rich and flexible in its expressive application. It was something they could use for forceful, brilliant, pathetic, even tragic opening movements, gentle or dreamy slow movements, and lively, often humorous closing movements. Viewed on the highest level, sonata form is simple enough. A very large-scale example of an A-B-A' form, usually with repetitions. So A repeat A, B A' repeat B A', or A repeat A, B A'. What is less simple and what makes sonata form different from other ABA forms is the nature and the function of the musical material in each section. This is implied by the special terms that are used for them. A is called the exposition, B is called the development, and A' is called the recapitulation. We need to look more closely at each of these terms and what they entail. So first is the exposition. The exposition of a sonata form movement is a large section of music in which the basic material of the movement is presented or exposed. The material always consists of the following elements. First, to begin, a main theme is presented in the first key, the tonic key. The first theme may be a tune, a group of small phrases that sound as though they are about to grow into a tune, or just a motive or two with a memorable rhythmic character. After the first theme is firmly established, often with the help of repetition, there is a change in key, or a modulation. The subsection of the exposition that accomplishes this is called the bridge, or the transition. The modulation in the bridge is an essential feature, even the essential feature, that gives sonata form its sense of dynamic forward movement. With a little experience, it is not hard to hear the contrast of key and sense of dynamism, for the idea is not to make the crucial modulation sound too smooth. There has to be a sense of tension in the way the new themes, now to be introduced, set in the new key. What comes next is a group of themes in the new key, called the second group. Composers generally make these new themes contrast with the first theme in melody, rhythm, dynamics, and so on, as well as in key. Usually one new theme stands out by its melodious quality. This is called the second theme. The last theme in the second group, the cadence theme or closing theme, is constructed so as to make a solid ending prior to a full stop and the big repeat. The very end of the exposition is marked by a loud series of repetitive cadences, as though the composer wanted listeners to know exactly where they were in the form. This A, or exposition section, was almost always repeated. We will, of course, hear some examples in a little while. The second section is the development, the B section. The development heightens the tonal thematic tension set up by the contrasting themes and keys of the exposition. The themes are developed by being broken up, recombined, reorchestrated, extended, and in general shown in unexpected and often exciting new contexts. Most development sections use counterpoint to create a sense of breakup and turmoil. In tonality, this section moves around relentlessly. There are frequent modulations that can easily be heard. The music sounds unstable. After considerable tension has been built up this way, the last modulation of the development section returns to the first key. The passage that accomplishes this is called the retransition, as the function of discharging the tension and preparing for the recapitulation comes. Classical composers were amazingly inventive in devising ways to make this crucial juncture of the form seem both fresh and inevitable. Finally comes the recapitulation, or A prime. With a real sense of relief or resolution, we now hear the first theme again, followed by all the other themes and other elements of the exposition. There may be minor changes, but in principle, everything comes back in its original order. Hence the name of this section, the recapitulation, meaning a step-by-step review. But there is an important difference. The music now remains in the same key, the tonic key. In practical terms, this means that the whole second group is relocated in the tonic to allow for this, the bridge, to be rewritten, often in a very interesting way. Stability of key in the recapitulation is especially welcome after the instability of the development section. Basically, as we've said, sonata form depends on a strong feeling of balance between exposition and recapitulation, but it is a weighted balance because A prime has achieved a no solidity. The entire B A prime sequence may be repeated. Whether this happens or not, another section in the tonic is usually added at the end, a post-mortem or wrap-up for the main action. This optional section is called the coda. Coda is a general term for a concluding section in any musical form. In the diagram that you can see right now for sonata form, changes of key or tonality are shown on a continuous band. Notice the tonal stability of the recapitulation, where the steady horizontal band contrasts dramatically with the fluctuations of the exposition and the development section. It may not be accidental that the terms used in discussing sonata form resemble those used in discussions of drama. We speak of the exposition of a play, where the initial situation is set forth, and of the development of the plot. Indeed, sonata form has a dramatic quality compared with the more architectural quality of Baroque music, such as a fugue. In a classical symphony, the themes seem almost like characters in a play or a novel or whom things are happening. They seem to change, take part in various actions, and react to other themes and musical processes. So let's take a look at our first symphony. And let's look at Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor, which we had a little sneak peek of earlier. So Mozart's Symphony in G minor is one of the most famous and admired of all his works. The opening movement, with its sharp contrast and clear demarcations, makes an arresting introduction to sonata form. Not many classical composers convey as dark and uneasy a mood as does this symphony. Not many classical symphonies are in a minor mode for that point as well. It suggests some kind of muted struggle against inevitable restraints. Mozart's themes alone would not have created this effect. If expressive as they are in themselves, they only attain their full pathos in their setting. Mozart needed sonata form to manage these expressive themes, in a sense, to give them something to struggle against. We are going to take a look at the first movement of this symphony that's simply called for its tempo, moto allegro. We've already cited this movement's opening texture, melody with a strictly homophonic accompaniment, as characteristic of the Viennese classical style. So also are the delicate, dynamic changes towards the end of the theme and the repeated loud cadences that terminate it. The unique nervous energy of this theme, a blend of refinement and subdued agitation, stamps the first movements unforgettably. In the exposition, the first theme is played twice. The second playing already begins the modulation to the exposition's second key, and a forceful bridge passage completes this process, after which the music comes to an abrupt stop. The second theme, in the major mode, is divided up measure by measure or phrase by phrase between the strings and the woodwinds. Then it is repeated with the role of the instruments reversed, the strings taking the notes in original played by the winds and vice versa. The instrumental alterations contribute something absolutely essential to the character of the theme and show Mozart's fine ear for tone color. The second appearance of the second theme does not come to a cadence, but runs into a series of new ideas which makes up the rest of the second group. Since all of them are so brief and leave so little impression on the rest of the movement, it is best not to consider them actual themes. One of these ideas begins to develop the motive of the first theme, a premature development process, one might think, but once again, it goes by so fast that we do not mistake it for the real development section. A short theme, forte, and a volley of repeated cadences bring the exposition to a very distinct stop. We still hear the rhythm of theme 1. After one dramatic chord wrenching us back from major to original key, the whole exposition is repeated. Next comes the development. 2 more dramatic chords, and then the development section starts quietly, with the first theme accompanied as before. It modulates at once and seems to be losing itself in grief until the rest of the orchestra bursts in with a furious contrapuntal treatment of that tender, nervous melody. This lengthy outburst seems to exhaust itself. It comes to a raging stop, but in the following piano passage, the modulations continue with orchestral echoes based on smaller and smaller portions of the melody as shown to the right. Breaking up a theme in this way is called fragmentation. Passion breaks out anew in another forte passage, but the modulations we notice have finally ceased. The fragmentation reaches its final stage. At last, the harmony seems to be waiting or preparing for something rather than shifting all the time. This passage is the retransition. Finally comes the recapitulation. After its fragmentation, the development section, the first theme somehow conveys new pathos when it returns in its original form and in the original tonic key. The bassoon has a beautiful new descending line, and pathos deepens when the second theme and all the other ideas in the second group, originally heard in a major key, are now recapitulated in the tonic key, which is minor. The result is a great many smaller but poignant alterations of the exposition material. Mozart had a special genius for such alterations. We should have no trouble sensing that he recapitulates in more stable than the exposition, because both the first and second groups are now in the same mode or minor key, as well as in the same key itself. Indeed, the bridge theme, much expanded, also hammers away at the minor mode in a way that recalls the contrapuntal outburst of the development section. Finally, in a very short coda, Mozart refers one last time to the first theme. It sounds utterly disheartened and then battered by the usual repeated cadences. We'll finish today's lesson by listening to this movement. I will be putting information up on the screen for you to let you know where we are in the piece and to help you follow along. But this will be the last thing we do today, and we'll see you next week when we look at a Haydn symphony. So please enjoy Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor, the first movement. So this is our first theme in that key of G minor. Now we'll hear that theme repeated again and begin to modulate, which will bring us to our bridge, which confirms our modulation, and this section is going to end with an abrupt cadence. There it is. On to our second theme here. Then we're going to hear it repeated again with a new ending. Now they're going to start to build some shorter ideas and different dynamics to echo that first theme. And as we close out this section, we'll hear a downward scale in forte, leading us to another cadence with an abrupt stop. In just a moment, you'll hear these downward scales. Here it is. Now the exposition is repeated. You can hear that this is an exact repetition of what we heard the first time in the exposition. After this abrupt stop, we're about to begin on the development section, where we're going to hear the first theme again, but it's going to be developed. with its original accompaniment and through modulation. Here we go. Now, we're about to come up to this contrapuntal section by the full orchestra. Here it is. Momentarily, it's going to begin to fragment and suddenly go piano. It echoes between strings and woodwinds. Here we go to a retransition with the full orchestra, which leads into a recapitulation. Here we go, recapping that first theme back in G minor, right as before. Now this time you'll notice, as we begin to modulate here in a few seconds, it's going to modulate differently than it did in the original A section. Here we go. Now we're moving to the bridge. Longer than before and with more elaborate counterpoint before coming to a cadence with an abrupt stop. Now, theme 2, piano in a minor mode. All the other second group themes are in the tonic key in the minor mode, and otherwise it's much the same as before. Finally, this will end on a scaled part of the cadence theme that we heard earlier. Part, we're going to come to the coda right now. Notice this new imitative passage based on the first theme. Then, after the repetition, we're going to repeated cadences. Stop this time is confirmed by 3 solid chords.